What truly happens when loyalty collides with destiny on a tower high above the sleeping castle? The air bites with cold, torches flicker against stone, and somewhere in the dark, two minds sharpen like blades. You probably won't survive this, but you'll understand it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm really curious. From which part of the world are you watching this video? Write your country in the comments. Let's see how far this little story has traveled. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing at wrought iron gates that have clearly seen better centuries, their twisted metal forming shapes that might be ravens, or might be something far less pleasant depending on how long you stare at them. And you really shouldn't stare at them for too long, trust me on this one. The Black family estate rises before you like a Gothic novel decided to become architecture, all sharp spires and windows that reflect no light despite the full moon hanging overhead like nature's own surveillance camera. A letter brought you here, written in ink the color of dried blood, which is either a very dramatic aesthetic choice or a concerning hygiene issue, and you're not entirely sure which option you'd prefer. The paper crinkled in your pocket carries words that promised answers to questions you didn't know you were asking. Questions about inheritance, about bloodlines, about why your grandmother always turned pale whenever anyone mentioned the name Black at family gatherings. Medieval English noble families often maintained elaborate genealogical records to establish their legitimacy and land claims, a practice that historians note became increasingly creative during the tumultuous Wars of the Roses period. Speaking of creative record-keeping, some lesser-known scholars have suggested that certain aristocratic families maintained secret parallel genealogies, documenting marriages and alliances that official church records conveniently forgot, though this theory remains what academics politely call contentious and what everyone else calls suspicious, but fascinating. The gate creaks open before you touch it, which is either automatic sensors or something you'd rather not think about, and as you step onto the gravel path, you notice that no weeds grow between the stones despite the obvious abandonment of the grounds. Your footsteps crunch louder than they should in the peculiar silence, and somewhere in the distance, a crow calls out what sounds remarkably like a laugh. The front door opens as you approach, and the butler standing in the doorway appears to be approximately 300 years old, which is either impressive longevity or deeply concerning, and you decide not to ask for identification. His name, he informs you in a voice like rustling parchment, is Grimsworth, because of course it is. You suppose expecting a butler named Kevin would have been wildly optimistic given the circumstances. He guides you through an entrance hall that could comfortably host a small wedding or a medium-sized existential crisis, the ceiling disappearing into shadows that the flickering candelabras refuse to illuminate. The walls are lined with portraits, dozens upon dozens of them, each featuring a figure dressed in the fashion of their respective era, but all sharing the same unsettling characteristics: high cheekbones sharp enough to qualify as weapons, dark hair that seems to absorb light, and eyes that definitely follow you as you walk past. One portrait from what appears to be the Elizabethan era shows a woman whose ruff collar is so elaborate she probably needed engineering assistance to put it on, and you swear you see her painted lips twitch into a smirk as Grimsworth drones on about house rules. The Tudor period saw some of the most extravagant fashion in English history, with noble families spending fortunes on clothing to display their wealth and status at court. Interestingly, there are fragmentary accounts from the period suggesting that certain families employed specialized tailors who incorporated hidden symbols and protective embroidery into their garments, though mainstream fashion historians tend to dismiss these claims as romantic embellishment. The scholarly debate continues in obscure textile journals that approximately 12 people read. Grimsworth explains that you have inherited something from a relative you never knew existed, which seems to be a running theme tonight, and he gestures toward a library at the end of the hall where all will be revealed. You think that's a rather dramatic way to phrase what is probably just a stack of dusty legal documents, but then again, Nothing about this evening has suggested subtlety is a family value. The portrait eyes follow you still, centuries of blacks watching your every step, and you wonder if this is how a museum exhibit feels when the visitors leave. Except you're the visitor here, and they're definitely not planning to leave. Grimsworth deposits you in the library with the practiced efficiency of someone who has delivered countless bewildered inheritors to this exact spot over the years, and you sink into a leather armchair that sighs with what sounds like relief or possibly resignation. The room surrounds you with books stacked floor to ceiling, their spines bearing titles in languages you recognize, and several you definitely don't. And the fire crackling in the hearth casts dancing shadows across a massive family tree painted directly onto the plaster wall. The tree's roots disappear into the floor as though it extends into the very foundation of the house, and its branches spread across the entire wall. Names and dates inscribed in gilt lettering that catches the firelight and seems to pulse with warmth you're not entirely comfortable with. At the trunk's base, you read the name that started everything, Corvinus Black, 1066 to 1142, and beneath it, in smaller script, the words Primus inter tenebras, first among darkness, if your extremely rusty Latin serves you correctly, which it probably doesn't. You lean closer to examine the dates, and the fire seems to dim as though the room itself is settling in to tell you a story, which is a deeply unsettling thought that you immediately try to dismiss as tired imagination. The year 1066 is famously known for the Norman conquest of England, when William the Conqueror defeated King Harold at the Battle of Hastings and fundamentally transformed English society, governance, and culture in ways that historians are still cataloging a millennium later. What fewer people know, however, is that in the chaos following the invasion, numerous smaller noble families from the continent quietly established themselves in England, some with documentation so murky that later genealogists threw up their hands in despair. One such genealogist reportedly wrote in 1847 that tracking the Black lineage was like attempting to map smoke. Corvinus Black, the voice of Grimsworth suddenly intones from a speaker you cannot locate because apparently he can narrate remotely now, arrived in England with William's forces but was no Norman. He came from somewhere further east, somewhere the records don't name, which is always reassuring when discussing your ancestors. The story unfolds before you like the pages of a book turning themselves, which they might actually be doing given the general atmosphere, and you see in your mind's eye a young man with those characteristic sharp features standing before a crossroads as medieval forests press close on all sides. Corvinus had nothing when he arrived on English soil. Nothing but ambition and a peculiar gift for being in the right place when powerful men needed dirty work done. And within 5 years he had accumulated enough wealth to purchase a barony that his contemporaries whispered came with a very unusual price. The bargain, according to family legend preserved in these very books, was struck on a moonless night at a standing stone that predated the Romans, one of those ancient monuments that dot the English countryside and make archaeologists write very long papers with lots of question marks. He knelt in darkness and spoke words in a language that wasn't quite Latin and wasn't quite anything else. And when he rose, his hair had turned from brown to black so deep it seemed to swallow the starlight. Hence the family name, though you suspect medieval peasants were not terribly creative with their nickname game. Modern scholars continue to debate whether such standing stone bargain narratives represent genuine folk memory of pre-Christian practices or simply colorful embellishments added by later generations with a flair for the dramatic. And honestly, looking at this family, you'd believe either explanation. The fire crackles and pops, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, and you notice that the painted tree seems slightly more detailed than it was a moment ago. New names appearing in the branches as though the wall itself is remembering things it had forgotten. Corvinus married 3 times, which was either romantic optimism or remarkable efficiency depending on your perspective, and each wife bore him children before mysteriously passing away under circumstances the records describe with suspiciously vague phrases like "took ill" and "departed suddenly." His first son, Aldrich, inherited the peculiar abilities that the family would spend centuries both exploiting and fearing, while his second son, Bertram, inherited only the ambition without any of the corresponding power, which is rather like inheriting a sports car without the keys, except the sports car can also apparently curse your enemies. The rivalry between these brothers would echo through generations, creating two distinct branches of the Black family tree that have been metaphorically and occasionally literally at each other's throats ever since. And you're starting to understand why your grandmother changed her name when she married your grandfather. You stand and approach the wall, running your fingers over the painted branches, and the surface is warmer than plaster should be, pulsing with something that might be central heating or might be several centuries of accumulated family drama. The names blur together as you scan upward. Corvinus begat Aldrich and Bertram. Aldrich begat Ophelia and Marcus. Marcus begat twins whose names are inscribed in what appears to be dried blood or very committed red paint. And so the generations continue, each one adding new branches and new mysteries to the ever-expanding tree. One particularly amusing entry from the 1400s notes that a Black named Prosperous attempted to rename the family Nightingale in an apparent bid for better public relations, an effort that lasted exactly 3 weeks before he mysteriously fell down a well, possibly an accident, probably not. Definitely a lesson in brand consistency. The medieval practice of hereditary surnames only became standardized in England around the 13th and 14th centuries, with families often adopting names based on their profession, location, or physical characteristics. Though some historians have noted that certain families seem to choose their names with rather more theatrical intent than strictly necessary. The library door opens without warning, and you spin around with the dignity of a startled cat, which is to say no dignity whatsoever, but the person entering doesn't seem to notice or care about your graceless display. A young woman about your age stands in the doorway, dressed in modern clothes that look almost aggressively normal against the Gothic backdrop, and she raises one perfectly shaped eyebrow in an expression that suggests she has evaluated you and found you mildly interesting at best. "Another cousin," she says, and the word drips with a weariness that implies she has said it many times before. I was hoping this generation might thin out, but apparently the family tree had other plans. She introduces herself as Morgana. Yes, like the Arthurian one, our family isn't exactly subtle with names, and explains that she has been researching the family history for the past 3 years, ever since she inherited this particular wing of the estate and its accompanying existential dread. Morgana settles into the armchair opposite yours with the ease of someone who has claimed this spot many times before, and as she begins to explain the curse in more detail, you notice that her eyes shift color slightly in the firelight, from brown to something almost golden. The Arthurian legends, including the character of Morgan Le Fay, were popularized in medieval literature, particularly through Geoffrey of Monmouth's 12th century writings, though the character herself likely draws on much older Celtic traditions of powerful women and goddess figures. One peculiar footnote in a 15th century manuscript held at the Bodleian Library suggests that several English noble families claimed actual descent from Arthurian figures, with one family insisting their ancestor had married one of Morgan Le Fay's daughters. Scholars remain divided on whether this represents genuine folk belief, political opportunism, or simply medieval nobles with too much time on their hands. Morgana explains that the curse manifests differently in each generation, sometimes as gifts that look suspiciously like burdens, and sometimes as burdens that look suspiciously like gifts, and the family has spent centuries arguing about which is which. The twins in the 1500s, whose names you noticed on the tree, were named Castor and Pollux in a burst of classical pretension that must have made the local priest extremely uncomfortable, and their rivalry made their ancestors Aldrich and Bertram look like friendly competitors at a village fete. Castor inherited the ability to see moments of the future, which sounds useful until you realize he couldn't control which moments or when he saw them, leading to several embarrassing incidents at formal dinners, and one memorable occasion when he interrupted his own wedding ceremony to announce that the dessert would be disappointing. He was right, but that's hardly the point. Pollux, meanwhile, inherited nothing visible but an insatiable jealousy that festered into something dangerous. and he spent 20 years trying to prove that his brother's visions were fraudulent, which is a remarkably committed denial for someone whose brother accurately predicted 3 deaths, 2 fires, and the exact date of a particularly severe thunderstorm. The brothers divided the family fortune, the family estate, and eventually the family tree itself, with Castor's descendants becoming the official, acknowledged line, while Pollux's children were quietly encouraged to seek their fortunes elsewhere, preferably on a different continent. Some of Pollux's descendants made their way to the colonies, where they promptly started their own dynasties of resentment and peculiar abilities. And you're beginning to suspect that your grandmother's branch might trace back to this less prestigious limb. The truly irritating thing, Morgana notes while examining her fingernails with studied casualness, is that both branches consider themselves the rightful heirs, and both branches have spent 500 years proving that the family gift for holding grudges is hereditary. She laughs at her own observation, and you notice that the painted family tree seems to shiver slightly on the wall. Though that's probably just the fire creating optical illusions. Definitely, absolutely, certainly. The history becomes more detailed as you move through the generations, and Morgana pulls a leather-bound journal from a shelf without looking, apparently knowing the library's organizational system by heart, or possibly by something else entirely. During the Wars of the Roses in the 15th century, the Black family found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having members on both the Lancastrian and Yorkist sides, not through political conviction, but simply because the family was already so divided that they automatically opposed each other's choices out of principle. One Black served in the court of Henry VI, while his cousin served Edward IV, and historical records suggest they met on opposite sides of at least 2 battles, which must have made family reunions particularly awkward, assuming they bothered having any. The fire dims further as Morgana turns pages, and you see illustrations in the journal that seem to move in your peripheral vision, but freeze whenever you look directly at them, like a game you didn't agree to play. The Tudor period brought new dangers, she explains, as the family's peculiar abilities attracted exactly the wrong kind of attention in an era when unusual talents could get one accused of witchcraft, heresy, or simply annoying the wrong nobleman on the wrong day. Several Blacks fled to Ireland, Scotland, and the continent during this period, carrying their gifts and their grudges with them like seeds that would bloom into new family branches in new soils. You learn that one ancestor apparently impressed Henry VIII with an uncanny ability to predict stock prices at the wool market, which earned him considerable wealth and also considerable suspicion when the king began wondering how exactly such predictions were possible. Fortunately, Henry became distracted by matrimonial issues before pursuing the matter further, which is perhaps the only time the king's romantic life benefited anyone besides himself. The economic upheavals of the Tudor period transformed English society fundamentally, with the dissolution of the monasteries and the enclosure movements creating new opportunities for wealth accumulation that families like the Blacks exploited with enthusiasm. Though historians debate whether their success reflected genuine business acumen or something rather more unusual. The journal's pages turn to the 17th century, and you settle deeper into your chair as the fire seems to respond to the narrative, burning lower and casting longer shadows that dance like figures from history brought briefly to life. Morgana's voice takes on a storyteller's rhythm as she describes the woman who would transform the Black family more profoundly than any invasion, any curse, any centuries-old bargain. Lysandra Ashworth, daughter of an apothecary, granddaughter of women whose knowledge predated the male-dominated universities by countless generations, and absolutely nobody's victim despite what the men of her era assumed. She arrived at the Black estate in 1623 as a potential bride for Edmund Black, the family heir whose gifts manifested as an unsettling ability to hear lies as physical sounds, a talent that had made him deeply paranoid and, ironically, a terrible judge of character when it came to people who genuinely cared about him. Lysandra saw through his defenses in approximately one afternoon, recognized his gift for what it was, and proceeded to spend the next 2 months teaching him the difference between deception and privacy, a distinction the Black family had apparently never considered. The marriage that followed was, by all accounts in the family records, a genuine love match, which seems almost revolutionary given the family's general approach to interpersonal relationships. Women in early modern England occupied complex social positions, with some historians arguing that they had more practical power than legal records suggest, while others point to the patriarchal structures that limited their official authority. The debate continues in academic circles, often quite heatedly. What made Lysandra truly remarkable, however, was not merely her emotional intelligence, but the knowledge she brought from her own family line, a tradition of herbalism, folk medicine, and what polite society called household management, but which involved considerably more interesting skills. Her grandmother had been one of those village-wise women who knew which plants cured which ailments, which roots could ease childbirth, and which mushrooms should absolutely never be eaten unless you wanted to see things that weren't there. Medical knowledge that the formal physicians of the era dismissed, but that actually worked considerably better than many of their own interventions. The black family tree on the wall seems to glow brighter around Lysandra's name, and you notice that her entry is decorated with small painted flowers that aren't present anywhere else on the design, a detail that feels deliberate and meaningful. She bore Edmund 4 children, 3 of whom survived to adulthood in an era when such survival rates were tragically considered good fortune, and she documented everything she knew in journals that still reside in this very library, their covers reinforced with leather and their pages protected by methods that Grimsworth refuses to explain. One of her more amusing contributions to family history was her systematic categorization of black family gifts across generations, creating what she called a taxonomy of the peculiar that attempted to find patterns in the chaos of inherited abilities. She noted with dry wit that the family's tendency toward foresight skipped every 3rd generation, that abilities related to animals always accompanied an unfortunate fear of horses, and that those who could influence dreams invariably snored loud enough to wake the dead, which, given the family, was probably a more literal concern than metaphor. Lysandra also instituted what she called practical defenses, a system of protective measures designed to shield the family from both external threats and their own more dangerous impulses, and some of these defenses apparently remain active in the estate to this day. She understood that the curse was not simply a punishment, but a legacy, something that could be shaped and directed if approached with wisdom rather than fear, and her influence transformed the family's relationship with their own nature over the following decades. The 17th century saw significant developments in natural philosophy and early scientific thinking, with figures like Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton laying groundwork for modern chemistry and physics, though Newton's own interests included extensive alchemical research that mainstream historians sometimes downplay. Lysandra's journals suggest she corresponded with several such natural philosophers, trading observations about the nature of reality in terms that blend science and something decidedly more mystical. The fire crackles particularly loudly, and you startle slightly, but Morgana simply continues her narration as though supernatural ambiance is entirely routine, which for her, it probably is. Lysandra's most lasting contribution came in 1642, as civil war began tearing England apart between parliamentarians and royalists, and the black family found themselves once again with members on opposing sides because apparently they never learned. She gathered representatives from both branches of the family, a feat that reportedly took 3 months of careful negotiation and one incident involving a possessed teapot, and established what became known as the Ashworth Accords, rules governing how the family would handle conflicts between members going forward. The Accords specified that no black could use their gift against another black during family disputes, that all inheritance matters would be resolved through arbitration rather than mysterious accidents, and that anyone attempting to circumvent these rules would face consequences vaguely described as unpleasant and thorough. You ask if the Accords worked, and Morgana's laugh carries genuine amusement. For about 80 years, which is practically an eternity by our family's standards. She explains that the Accords held through the Civil War, through the Commonwealth, through the Restoration, and through the Glorious Revolution, only finally breaking down in the early 18th century when a dispute over a rare book collection escalated beyond all reasonable proportion. The English Civil War period saw massive social upheaval, with some historians estimating that a higher percentage of the population died than in World War I, making it one of the most traumatic periods in British history. Various fringe historians have suggested that certain families used the chaos to settle old scores and expand their influence, though mainstream scholarship tends to focus on political and religious factors. Lysandra herself lived to the remarkable age of 87, surviving her husband by 23 years and becoming the family matriarch whose word was law, whose wisdom was respected, and whose recipes for both healing potions and excellent pastries were passed down through generations with equal reverence. Her final journal entry, dated 1683, simply reads, "I have done what I could. The rest is up to them." The bread recipe is on page 47. The fire in the library has burned low enough that Grimsworth, who apparently materializes when needed like a spectral butler service, adds fresh logs without being asked, and the renewed flames cast new shadows that seem to pulse with the weight of what comes next in the story. Morgana sets down the journal from Lysandra's era and retrieves another, this one bound in leather so dark it appears to absorb light, its cover unmarked by title or date, as though the contents were too dangerous for casual identification. The period between 1680 and 1750, she explains, became known within the family as the Burning Years, not because anything literally burned, although a few things did, but because the scrutiny directed at unusual families intensified throughout Europe in ways that still echo in cultural memory. The Salem witch trials in colonial Massachusetts in 1692 represented perhaps the most famous example of this paranoid period, resulting in the execution of 20 people and the imprisonment of many more based on spectral evidence and community tensions that had little to do with actual supernatural activity. The Black family, with their documented history of peculiar abilities and their stubborn refusal to behave normally, found themselves under investigation multiple times during this era, and the family archives contain at least 7 separate formal accusations that required careful handling. You ask how they survived, and Morgana smiles with an expression that suggests the answer involves methods that wouldn't hold up in any court, supernatural or otherwise. The first major threat came in 1684. When a local magistrate named Whitmore became convinced that the Black family's consistent good fortune in business matters indicated demonic assistance, which is frankly a reasonable conclusion even if his methodology left something to be desired. He launched an investigation that included interviews with servants, reviews of financial records, and one memorable attempt to sneak onto the property at midnight that ended with him inexplicably lost in the gardens until dawn, despite the gardens being roughly the size of a modest backyard. Whitmore's investigation ultimately concluded with a report stating that the Black family was peculiar, but not provably diabolical, which became something of a family motto for the next century, occasionally appearing on unofficial family crests and once on a particularly passive-aggressive Christmas card. The real danger, Morgana continues, came from within the family as much as from outside it, because paranoid times encourage paranoid behaviors, and several family members began suspecting each other of collaboration with the authorities. Silas Black, a particularly unpleasant individual whose portrait shows a man with a permanent expression of digestive distress, accused his cousin Temperance of practicing forbidden arts that would bring the witch hunters down upon them all, which was rich, coming from a man who kept a familiar that disguised itself as a very aggressive goose. The family archives document increasingly absurd accusations flying between branches, with one family member accused of turning the milk sour through supernatural means, when in fact the dairy simply had a leaky roof, and another accused of causing a neighbor's chickens to stop laying when the chickens were actually just old. Not everything is supernatural, it turns out. Sometimes poultry simply retires. However, the persecution threat was real enough that the family began constructing hidden vaults beneath the estate, chambers designed to preserve their most dangerous and valuable possessions should the worst come to pass. You ask to see these vaults, and Morgana's expression suggests you've asked something that requires careful consideration before she nods slowly and rises from her chair. The journey through the house takes you down corridors you hadn't noticed before, past rooms whose doors don't quite seem to connect to the spaces they should based on the exterior architecture, until you reach a staircase that descends into darkness that your eyes gradually adjust to. Historical records indicate that many Old English estates contained priest holes and hidden chambers from the Elizabethan era, when Catholic families needed to hide their priests from Protestant authorities. Less conventional historians suggest that some families maintained hidden spaces for rather different purposes, though the scholarly consensus dismisses these claims as sensationalist speculation. The vaults themselves are surprisingly modern in their organization, with climate control systems humming quietly alongside older preservation methods that involve herbs and symbols painted in substances you'd rather not identify. Rows of books, artifacts, and sealed containers fill the shelves, each labeled with dates and descriptions in handwriting spanning centuries, and the air smells of dust, old paper, and something faintly metallic that might be blood or might be very old pennies. You hope it's pennies. Morgana guides you past the general collection to a specific case containing objects from the burning years, including a journal that documents every accusation the family faced and how each was resolved. Some resolutions involved legal maneuvering, some involved strategic gifts to appropriate officials, and some are described only as handled by grandmother's recipe without further elaboration, which seems deliberately ominous. The most valuable item from this period, she explains, is a book of remedies and methods compiled by a Black who worked as a physician's assistant, documenting treatments that actually worked alongside observations about which family abilities could be applied to healing without attracting unwanted attention. The vaults also contain items from the colonial branches of the family, shipped back to England during various periods of crisis, and you spot artifacts that clearly originated from the American colonies, the Caribbean, and places further afield that suggest the Black diaspora spread more widely than you'd imagined. One case contains letters from a Black who settled in Salem itself, describing the trials from an insider's perspective and expressing frustration that the accusations targeted the innocent, while the genuinely unusual families managed to escape notice through a combination of luck and strategic invisibility. You spend what feels like hours in the vaults, but is probably only 30 minutes according to your watch, which you're not entirely sure you can trust in this house, before Morgana guides you back to the library, where the fire still burns and the painted tree still watches. The story continues into the 18th century, and you settle back into your chair with the peculiar comfort that comes from becoming accustomed to discomfort, like wearing in a new pair of shoes, except the shoes are a family curse spanning generations. Morgana produces a smaller journal, this one decorated with childish drawings on its cover that seem incongruous with the gravity of the archives, and she explains that this belonged to a young girl named Prudence Black, who was born in 1742 and developed abilities that terrified even her supposedly unflappable family. Prudence could see things, not the future like some of her ancestors, but the hidden truths of people and objects, the histories that clung to possessions like invisible cobwebs, the secrets that people thought they'd successfully buried in the corners of their minds. At age 4, she informed her mother exactly where her father's first wife was buried, information that the family had carefully concealed for 15 years and that Prudence had no possible way of knowing through conventional means. The dinner following this revelation was, according to family records, notably quiet. By age 7, she was being kept in a nursery with specially constructed walls designed to muffle her observations about the household staff's various indiscretions, romantic entanglements, and one ongoing embezzlement scheme that had apparently been operating for decades. The Georgian era saw significant developments in both rational philosophy and popular supernatural beliefs, with the early 18th century producing both the foundations of modern empirical science and a flourishing interest in ghosts, second sight, and mystical traditions. Scholars continue to debate how these seemingly contradictory movements coexisted and influenced each other. Prudence's abilities made her simultaneously the most valuable and most dangerous member of her generation, as her insights could resolve any dispute, uncover any hidden information, and also reveal truths that absolutely nobody wanted known. One relatively amusing incident involved a visiting earl whose dignified bearing completely collapsed when young Prudence politely inquired about the funny thing he did with the sheep, though family records note that the earl's subsequent departure was rather hasty and his Christmas gift that year was surprisingly generous. The child who saw too much became, by necessity, a child who learned to keep quiet about what she saw, and her journals document this painful process of self-censorship in handwriting that matures from childish scrawl to elegant script over the course of years. She learned to smile pleasantly when she saw the darkness in someone's past, to nod politely when she recognized objects that had been used for terrible purposes, to maintain the social niceties that kept her safe in a world that would happily burn unusual children if given sufficient excuse. Her journals contain observations about the curse itself that no previous family member had been able to articulate, insights that came from seeing the very fabric of the Black legacy as it wound through generations like a particularly persistent vine. She wrote at age 12, "The bargain Corvinus made was not for power alone, but for legacy, and the price is that every gift comes weighted with shadow, every blessing twinned with burden, every light casting darkness longer than itself." This insight became central to later family understanding of their condition, though Morgana notes that plenty of family members have chosen to ignore it entirely, because acknowledging your problems is considerably less fun than pretending they don't exist. Prudence eventually developed methods for controlling her ability, techniques she documented meticulously so that future generations with similar gifts might suffer less than she had, and these methods remain in use today by family members whose abilities trend toward the intrusive. She learned that grounding herself in physical sensations, the texture of fabric, the smell of flowers, the taste of something pleasantly sour, could create buffers against unwanted visions, and she pioneered the use of what she called mental rooms, imaginary spaces where she could temporarily set aside knowledge too heavy to carry constantly. At 18, she married a man from a completely normal family, someone blissfully ordinary whose greatest secret was that he disliked his mother's cooking, and she spent 40 years building a life that was as conventional as possible given her nature. Her children inherited varying degrees of her gift, and she trained each of them with patience and compassion that her own upbringing had sometimes lacked, breaking the cycle of fear and isolation that had characterized previous generations' approaches to unusual children. The 18th century saw significant developments in educational philosophy, with thinkers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau proposing new approaches to childhood development that emphasize nurture over harsh discipline. Some unusual historians have suggested that certain families developed their own educational traditions that mainstream pedagogy has only recently begun to discover, though this remains a minority position. Prudence lived to see the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the first stirrings of the Industrial Revolution, and her later journals reflect a woman who had made peace with her abilities and found genuine contentment despite them. Her final entry, written in 1814 at the remarkable age of 72, reads, "I have seen too much and spoken too little, loved deeply and feared less than I expected. And if my descendants are reading this, remember, some secrets are better kept, but the ones about yourself are better shared with someone who loves you anyway." You ask if anyone in the current generation has abilities like Prudence's, and Morgana's hesitation before answering tells you more than her words do when she finally admits that yes, there is one, and that family member finds the gift exactly as difficult as their ancestor did. The clock in the library strikes an hour that seems mathematically improbable given how long you've been sitting here. But time apparently moves differently in houses built on centuries of peculiar bargains, which is either comforting or concerning, depending on your perspective. Morgana sets aside Prudence's journals and produces a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, correspondence from the Victorian era that documents what she calls the Great Attempt, a concerted effort by one family member to break the curse entirely and free future generations from its weight. Augustus Black was born in 1838 into a family that had mostly made peace with their unusual nature, treating it as simply another family characteristic like the distinctive cheekbones or the tendency toward dramatic gestures. But Augustus was never satisfied with acceptance when reform might be possible. He studied at Oxford, where he apparently scandalized his tutors by asking uncomfortable questions about the nature of inherited characteristics decades before genetics became a formal science. And he spent his 20s traveling to every archive, library, and unusual collection that might contain information about breaking hereditary curses. The Victorian era saw unprecedented interest in both scientific rationalism and supernatural phenomena, with organizations like the Society for Psychical Research conducting serious investigations into ghosts, telepathy, and other unusual claims alongside the development of evolutionary biology and germ theory. This seemingly contradictory intellectual landscape allowed someone like Augustus to pursue his research without being immediately dismissed as a lunatic. His letters describe journeys to Egypt to study ancient texts, to India to consult with practitioners of traditions older than English history, to the Americas to meet with indigenous peoples whose knowledge of spiritual matters predated European arrival by millennia. Everywhere he went, he sought the same thing, a way to untangle what Corvinus had bound. One of Augustus's more entertaining letters describes his attempt to replicate what he believed was the original bargain in reverse, standing at a different standing stone on a different moonless night, and speaking what he hoped were the right words backward. The attempt resulted in absolutely nothing happening except that he caught a severe cold that lasted 3 weeks, leading him to conclude that either he'd gotten the procedure wrong or the universe has a sense of ironic humor. He tried alchemical solutions, psychological approaches, religious interventions from multiple traditions, and one memorable attempt involving a medium who turned out to be entirely fraudulent, which must have been disappointing for someone seeking genuine supernatural assistance. Despite his failures, Augustus's research produced unexpected benefits, as his extensive documentation of family history became the foundation of the archives that Morgana now maintains, and his network of correspondence included scholars, mystics, and unusual individuals across the globe. His investigation also revealed the existence of other families with similar legacies, lineages burdened with their own versions of inherited strangeness, and he proposed creating an alliance of such families that never quite materialized, but became the basis for relationships that persist to this day. The 19th century saw the emergence of anthropology as a formal discipline, with scholars beginning to systematically document unusual beliefs and practices across cultures. Some fringe researchers have suggested that this academic interest sometimes served as cover for more practical investigations into genuine supernatural phenomena, though mainstream historians dismiss this as conspiracy thinking. Augustus eventually married a woman named Victoria, which must have been confusing during conversations about current events, and together they had 7 children, each of whom inherited varying degrees of family peculiarity, along with their father's tendency toward obsessive research. His attempts to break the curse never succeeded, but his documentation of those attempts provided future generations with a roadmap of what not to try, which is perhaps less glamorous but considerably more useful. His final years were spent in this very estate, organizing the archives and training his children to continue his work, and he died in 1912 at the age of 74, convinced that someone eventually would find the answer even if he hadn't. His last words, according to family legend, were either "the key is in the foundation" or "the cook is in the kitchen," depending on which family member you ask. And this ambiguity has led to decades of either architectural investigation or confusion about mealtimes. Morgana explains that every generation since Augustus has produced at least one person who attempts to break the curse, and every attempt has failed, though each failure has taught the family something new about the nature of their legacy. progress through persistent failure, which is either inspiring or depressing. One particularly dedicated attempt in the 1960s involved a Black who became convinced that the curse could be neutralized through psychedelic exploration. And while this approach produced extensive documentation of unusual mental states, it did not actually accomplish the primary goal and mostly resulted in some very interesting artwork that still hangs in the West Wing. The fire burns lower still, and you realize that the story is approaching the present day, the period you should theoretically know about from your own family's silence on the matter. Academic discourse around inherited trauma and epigenetics has grown significantly in recent decades, with researchers exploring how experiences and their effects might be passed down through generations in ways that earlier science couldn't explain. Scholars continue to debate the mechanisms and implications of such inheritance, creating a surprisingly receptive climate for families whose legacies are rather more dramatic than the typical case study. Morgana closes the Victorian correspondence and looks at you directly for the first time in what feels like hours, her expression shifting from narrator to something more personal, more invested in your response to what comes next. The 20th century, she explains, changed everything and nothing for the Black family. World wars disrupted old patterns, while new technologies created both opportunities and dangers. And through it all, the curse continued its patient, persistent influence across generations. Your grandmother's generation was born in the interwar period, that strange pause between catastrophes when people tried desperately to believe that humanity had learned something from the trenches, and the Black family optimism proved exactly as misguided as everyone else's. Several family members served in World War II, their abilities finding unexpected applications in intelligence work and resistance activities. And more than one Black earned quiet decorations for services that the official records describe in frustratingly vague terms. World War II saw extensive government interest in unusual phenomena, with both Allied and Axis powers investigating everything from remote viewing to psychological manipulation, much of which was later dismissed as wartime desperation, but which created lasting institutional interest in subjects that respectable science generally ignored. Certain archives remain classified to this day, leaving the scholarly record incomplete in ways that some researchers find deeply frustrating. Your grandmother, you learn, was born in 1945, the year the war ended, and she inherited what the family calls the quiet gift, an ability to create spaces of calm, of peace, of comfort that went beyond normal human capacity for empathy. This sounds pleasant until Morgana explains that your grandmother also inherited the gift's shadow side, an ability to sense distress that she could never turn off, making her constantly aware of suffering she couldn't always help. The revelation lands differently than you expected, explaining things about your grandmother you'd always wondered about. Her insistence on keeping a peaceful home, her visible distress during news broadcasts, her tendency to know when something was wrong before anyone told her. She left the family, changed her name, and tried to live a normal life. And for the most part, she succeeded, raising your parent in happy ignorance of their heritage while carrying the weight of knowledge alone. You ask why she never told anyone, and Morgana's shrug carries generations of understanding. Because she thought she could protect you by keeping you in darkness, which is what every parent in this family thinks, and which has never once worked. The estate around you seems more present now, its walls and floors and centuries of accumulated history pressing closer as the story reaches your own lifetime. Your parent, you learn, showed no signs of inheritance and was never told about the family, a mercy that became complicated when you were born and started exhibiting signs that your grandmother recognized but couldn't explain to anyone else. You don't remember anything unusual about your childhood, but Morgana produces a letter your grandmother wrote to the family solicitor, expressing concern about certain sensitivities you displayed as a toddler, behaviors that the family recognized as early manifestations of the curse, but that ordinary doctors dismissed as normal developmental variation. The letter asks for guidance on whether to tell your parent the truth, and the response from the family, clinical, distant, suggesting various protocols for observation and management, apparently convinced your grandmother to burn all bridges and ensure you grew up knowing nothing. The realization that you've been documented without your knowledge or consent since early childhood feels invasive. And Morgana acknowledges this with a nod that suggests she understands the violation even as she continues explaining its context. The contemporary world presents challenges that no previous generation faced, she notes: the internet, surveillance technology, genetic testing that might inadvertently flag unusual characteristics, social media that makes privacy increasingly impossible. Modern family members must navigate a world that leaves far fewer shadows to hide in while the curse continues its ancient patterns regardless of technological change. Your inheritance, she finally explains, is twofold: property within the estate, funds held in trust for generations, and membership in a family that will never be entirely normal no matter how hard anyone tries. But more importantly, you've inherited a choice that your grandmother never got to make freely. The choice about whether to embrace your legacy, to learn about your abilities, to join the ongoing project of understanding and managing the Black family curse. Some descendants have chosen to walk away, and the family respects this, providing financial support and asking only for occasional medical updates that help track inheritance patterns. Others have chosen to engage fully, living in or near the estate, contributing to the archives, raising their children with full knowledge of what they are. You ask what Morgana chose, and her answer surprises you. I'm still deciding, and I've been here 3 years. The curse gives us plenty of things, but certainty isn't one of them. The fire has burned to embers now, casting a gentle orange glow that softens the library's gothic edges into something approaching warmth, and you realize that the night has grown quiet in ways that feel intentional, as though the house itself is settling down to rest. Morgana stops speaking, and for a long moment you simply sit together in comfortable silence. Two distant relatives connected by blood and secret, and the peculiar weight of knowing too much about where you come from. The painted family tree on the wall seems less menacing in the dim light, its branches and names becoming gentle reminders of continuity rather than threatening displays of accumulation, and you notice for the first time that small flowers dot the tree wherever Lysandra's descendants appear, a tribute maintained across centuries to the woman who brought healing to a wounded lineage. Your eyes grow heavy in the warmth, and the chair seems to embrace you, like the house itself is offering comfort, an unexpected kindness from stone walls that have witnessed so much struggle. Morgana rises quietly and drapes a soft blanket over your shoulders, one of those gestures that transcends family drama and speaks simply to the human need for care, for warmth, for someone to notice when you're tired. The wind outside has stilled, and if you listen carefully, you can hear the old house breathing its slow, patient rhythm, the creak of ancient timbers settling into their evening positions like an elderly relative lowering themselves into a favorite chair. Tomorrow there will be decisions to make, documents to review, questions to ask about abilities you may or may not have inherited and what they might mean for your future. But tonight is for rest, for letting the story sink into your bones like warmth from the dying fire, for trusting that understanding will come in its own time as it has for generations before you. The portraits on the walls seem less watchful now, their painted eyes half closed as though they too are ready for sleep. Generations of blacks finally at peace in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn. Your breathing slows to match the house's rhythm, and the ember light traces gentle patterns on your closed eyelids like a grandmother's fingers smoothing hair from a tired forehead. The curse, whatever it truly is, will still be there in the morning, but its weight feels lighter somehow, shared now across your newly discovered family instead of carried unknowing and alone. Stars wheel slowly outside the library windows, the same stars that watched Corvinus make his ancient bargain, that witnessed Lysandra's gentle revolution, that guided Augustus on his worldwide search for answers that remain unfound but no longer seem quite so urgent in this peaceful moment. The embers fade from orange to red to deep, soft gray, and the last thing you notice before sleep claims you completely is the sound of wind through distant trees, a lullaby that has played across these grounds for centuries, carrying the dreams of blacks who came before you and those who will come after. Sleep now, inheritor of mysteries. The morning will bring its challenges, but this moment belongs to rest, to peace, to the simple gift of being exactly where you need to be.